השמיים מעל ההר גייסה בירת סומלילנד התמלאו הלילה בזקוקי דינור. דגל ישראל הוקרן על מבנה בעיר וברחובות חגגו המונים. אחרי יותר מ3 עשורים של המתנה, סומלילנד מקבלת את מה שחלמה עליו, הכרה רשמית ממדינה ראשונה בעולם החברה באום, מדינת ישראל.
That brief clip was showing the jubilation in Somaliland last week when Israel became the first United Nations state to recognize the country. Where and what is Somaliland, you ask? So did I. I'm guessing that North American and European mainstream media has not covered this issue, and Israel's recent recognition of Somaliland proved me wrong. But it's a huge story in the Middle East. And in the second part of this podcast, we are going to take a deep dive into this development with our guest today, State of Tel Aviv and Beyond regular, the indubitable Lieutenant Colonel in Reserves, Jonathan Conricus. Good friend of this podcast, brilliant analyst and communicator and commentator, and we so appreciate his ongoing contribution to State of Tel Aviv and beyond. And I know that you, our subscribers, do as well. And what a way to kick off the year, Season 4, Episode 1, with Jonathan Conricus. This is a special episode. I spoke at length with Jonathan on Thursday, January 1st, New Year's Day. Turns out he is something of an expert on the Horn of Africa, including Somaliland. I had no idea. It's a fascinating conversation, and you will learn a lot, as did I. We begin today by zooming in on the Gaza Strip. There was so much optimism in early October and in the immediate aftermath of the release of 20 living Hamas hostages on October 13th. I still can't believe it happened, to be honest. It really did seem that anything was possible in that moment. But since then, the ambitious Trump peace plan has been stuck. We discuss why this is happening, why this impasse has arisen, and what might get things moving again. The final portion of this podcast consists of Conricus and I getting into the Middle East more broadly. We predict, prognosticate, and doing that in this region is a very hazardous endeavor, but we do our best. I flew yesterday, Saturday, from Tel Aviv to Kigali by way of Addis Ababa. A surprisingly easy trip. By the time I landed in Rwanda late afternoon, Maduro was in U.S. custody, and jubilation had overtaken the streets of Venezuela and communities, diaspora communities throughout the world. Venezuela was a very close ally of Iran, and this very bold move by the United States is not good news for the Iranian regime. On January 2nd, President Trump issued the post that you see now on the screen on social media. If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. Especially in the wake of Venezuela, those are very meaningful words. Never a dull moment in this part of the world. I'm just waiting now for the Qataris to issue a follow-up statement blaming the Jews, Israel, and Netanyahu for the ousting of Maduro. True story, the vice president of Venezuela has already blamed the Zionists. Didn't take long. Yes, things are very dynamic. Okay, back to Jonathan Conricus. In the third part of this podcast, he takes us on a tour de force of the region. We talk about Iran, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and more. And you don't want to miss that. The regional analysis with Conricus is available to premium subscribers to State of Tel Aviv and beyond only. If you've not already subscribed, perhaps now is the time. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now coming to you from the heart of Africa, beautiful Rwanda. Let's do this. Happy New Year, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. Thank
Shalom.
you for joining. Shalom. Thank you for joining State of Tel Aviv today on New Year's Day. What a treat.
A treat indeed. Fresh year in Israel and good opportunity to wish all of those who have been listening in 24 and 25 to our interviews a great, excellent, and bountiful 2026.
Amen to that. And in fact, our interviews, Lieutenant Colonel, go back to 2023.
Do
Things
they?
were,
Right.
yes, they do, immediately following October 7th. Looking forward to 2026. It's January 1st, 2026. And we have so much on our plates and so much to talk about. But I want to begin with the Trump peace plan and the Gaza Strip. Things seem still to be stuck. We really haven't made much progress since October 13th, aside from receiving back all of the hostages living and murdered, except for one, Ron Gvili, who remains in the
Yep.
Gaza Strip. And we've made some progress with respect to demolishing the Hamas tunnel infrastructure, below ground, of course, as well as their military infrastructure above ground. We still control at least 50% of the Gaza Strip. But Hamas, as we know, remains standing as a political force, as a military force. And those two things, disarming Hamas and having them relinquish power, were critical first elements of the Trump peace plan. So, how do you assess this, what appears to be an impasse? Where do you think we're going? And perhaps start that off by talking a bit about the visit in the last few days by Prime Minister Netanyahu to see President Trump at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah. So if we intend and we're promising here to be forward looking. We'll tether the forward looking a bit in the past. And I think we can start with, of course, with speaking about Mar a Lago and the diplomatic and overt part of it. And then I'd be happy to just cover where I think things are going. Really interesting trends that may be developing when looking at Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and Jordan. A bit further than 2026, I think Turkey and Egypt need to be mentioned from a security perspective. But if we want to focus on the here and now and the most pressing, then yeah, Gaza. Mar-a-Lago, I think, as an Israeli, putting politics aside, and we're coming up to an election year, and everything in Israel is now going to be measured and weighted according to the political benefit, and politicians are going to do all kinds of crazy, reckless, nonsensical things in order to curry votes and to get headlines. And it's going election season. We've been there before. We know the drill. But that aside, looking at the outcome of Mar-a-Lago, I think as an Israeli, pretty good, pretty solid. I'd give it an 80, perhaps. 90 in terms of window dressing and perhaps 80 in terms of substance. Window dressing as in what was the real visual impact of how things looked from an Israeli-American perspective, and then 80 in terms of the bottom line and content. So overall, pretty good. Where reality in my mind kind of differs is that, as you say politely in diplomatic language, impasse, yeah, we're stuck. Hamas is still in Gaza. They have absolutely no plans of leaving or disarming. And currently, there does not appear to be a viable option of or a tool how to disarm them, short of Israel relaunching full-scale kinetic operations in Gaza. And for various reasons, I don't think that Israel will be allowed to do such a thing, even though from a pure military point of view, that may very well be what's necessary to do, because if we're going to stick to the format, the Trump plan and the Security Council resolution, the format stipulates pretty clearly. Phase one ends, and only when it ends do we move on to phase two, And phase two is the beginning of transition of power, the disarmament of Hamas, transition of power to the International Security Stabilization Force, Palestinian governance of technocrats, and rebuilding of Gaza, infrastructure, investment, and all of that. And yeah, we had tremendous achievement in the fact that our live and almost all of our murdered hostages were returned. But other than that, very little. And I just spoke with a group of non-Jewish students who are here visiting, a delegation brought here by the Jewish National Fund. Interesting to meet non-Jewish students here in Israel and learn a lot from their questions. And when they asked me about where do we stand and how optimistic am I about the future, I said I'm very optimistic about the future, and I laid out the reasons why. And I told them about the achievements of 25 and sure, the challenges that we have in 26 and forward. But I said that the area where I am the least optimistic is regarding Gaza, because I do not recognize neither political will nor military capacity to do what is necessary in order to improve the situation. We don't have any takers, nation states that are willing and capable of going in and conducting what we would call in UN parlance peace enforcement, as in using violence in order to establish peace or in order to minimize friction. A Chapter 7 type of mission. We don't see any countries. There's been talk about Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, about Pakistan, but none of them have stepped up and said, yes, Hineni, here I am, and I'm willing to go in and do the heavy lifting, knowing that it's going to include combat and that it's going to include casualties and that there will be soldiers, unfortunately, that will be transported back home in coffins. That is the reality, and I think that is the most deterring factor so far, knowing that it's unfinished business in Gaza, that Hamas is still there, and every day that goes by, Hamas entrenches itself and remains in power. It may not flourish, and there's surely a lot of suffering and a lot of instability still, but every day that goes by, Hamas cements its presence even more. So that's sadly where I see the situation. A lot has been said and spoken and debated, including at Mar-a-Lago, about whether or not there will be a Turkish presence. I don't think that's something that really is going to happen. I know that there are people who believe that it's feasible. I know that there are lots of people who are recommending it. And of course, that the Turks are very eager to do so. I think it would be a very poor long-term strategic blunder by Israel if it were to allow the Turks a foothold in Gaza. And I surely hope that won't happen. If it will, that'll be really an opening for all kinds of challenges, intel and subversion, and many other issues that I don't think that Israel has the bandwidth or the need to be dealing with. And I hope that the government will be able to prevent that from happening.
I'd like to pause here to play two clips from the press conference that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu held at Mar-a-Lago following a quite intense day of meetings just before the new year. First, let's look at this. President Trump, when asked about Hamas.
Mr. President, if you don't see Hamas disarm in that short amount of time that you're giving them, can you tell us what the next steps would be?
It'll be horrible for them. Horrible. It's going to be really, really bad for them. And I don't want that to happen. But they made an agreement that they were going to disarm. And you couldn't blame Israel. By the way, we have other countries that will come in and do it. They said, let us do it for you if they don't. Countries that were with them wanted the deal to be made, agreed that they would disarm. And now if they say they're going to disarm, that's fine. If they say they're not going to disarm, those same countries will go and wipe them out. They don't even need Israel. You know, we have many countries, 59 countries that are in agreement. This is a real peace in the Middle East. And Hamas is a small part of it, but it's still a part of it. But we have 59 countries that signed on, big countries, countries that are outside of the Middle East, as you know the Middle East. They want to go in and wipe out Hamas. They don't want Israel. They don't need Israel. They want to do it because it's the right thing to do, because they were for the deal based on the fact that Hamas pledged, they swore that they were going to disarm. Now, if they're not going to disarm, those same countries will wipe out Hamas.
Immediately after that last question, President Trump was asked to comment on the involvement of the Palestinian Authority in governing the Gaza Strip. Here's what he had to say.
Trump, do you think that the PA should be involved the day after in Gaza Strip, even in the near future? And the same question to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you see a real opportunity that the PA will be in Gaza?
Go ahead, Mimi.
I think President Trump put clearly the conditions of reform that he wants to see in the PA for them to be involved. And I think he put it very clearly what he wants to see, the kind of real reforms, not just perfunctory reforms, but real reforms. Stop pay to slay, change the curriculum in your textbooks, open up, a different society and a different future. If they do it, well, let them. I think it was clear. He put
Pretty clear.
He put guidelines that were, by the way, in the Trump plan of 2020, and they were put then in the 20 points, and it's up to them.
It's interesting. You say that there are some countries, I assume, that think that Turkey participating in this ISF, International Stabilization Force, might be a good idea. Who, other than Qatar, might think that way, and possibly Egypt?
Well, I think that parts of the U.S. establishment, political mostly, less military, have voiced support of that. Obviously, the president has been at least 50% positive towards it, and he is courting the idea, or looks as if he's warming to the idea. And then, obviously, Turkey itself, you mentioned Qatar correctly. I think I've heard insinuations from the Iranians, not clear official support, but I would assume and assess that they would more or less be in favor of it, not because they are fans of the Turks and not because they want to see Turkish expansion. They are adversarial, the Iranians and the Turks, but because they know that it would be a challenge for Israel, and it's something that Israel doesn't want.
So you gave the whole Mar-a-Lago meeting, in terms of substance, 8 out of 10. On what basis?
I think that there was a lot of buildup, and a lot of sour journalists, Israeli and international, were trying to make the usual very old buildup of as if there's a lot of daylight and disputes and tension between the two allies. And I think it should have been laid to rest a long time ago. I mean, I understand that media workers need to sell advertising space, and that there needs to be some story. But, the story of, how angry is Trump with Bibi, and how big are the differences between the U.S. and Israel, it's been spoken about so many times, and it's been debunked quite a lot of times, almost as many times as it's been raised ahead of meetings. So in terms of substance, looking at how President Trump answered questions about Israeli posture versus Hamas, how President Trump addressed Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, very important. Clarity, that I think really ruffled Iranian feathers. Clarity from President Trump about red lines, what will be tolerated and what will not be tolerated. Very important. For the first time, the president said very clearly that before we were focusing, the U.S. was focusing on nuclear weapons and the military nuclear weapons program. Now it's the nuclear weapons program and also ballistic missiles. That is a strategic achievement for Israel, because that is what Israel has been speaking about and targeting, because Israel understands very clearly, as does the American military, that for the Iranians to have a nuclear weapons program doesn't mean a lot if they don't have the delivery systems, which are the ballistic missiles. And therefore, they are one. And this was, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that we saw the president really accommodate that line of thought and express very clearly that if the Iranians try to fix their nuclear weapons program, it'll be an immediate attack by the US and Israel. And if they'll focus on ballistic missiles, which they are, then it's a very probable and a likely attack by the US or by Israel. And those are strong statements.
I'm going to cut in here briefly and show you the clip of President Trump addressing exactly what Jonathan Conricus is speaking of here at the Mar-a-Lago press conference when he was asked to comment. Have a look and listen.
Remember this, if we didn't do what we did to Iran, just to make the subject just slightly different, you wouldn't have peace in the Middle East. You wouldn't have a deal signed in the Middle East. You wouldn't have a deal. Because other Arab nations, which are great people, I know them very well, I know them well, they're great people, they wouldn't be able to have agreed to peace in the Middle East because you would have had a dark cloud hanging over everything. It wouldn't have been possible. So Iran has been greatly reduced in power, prestige. I don't want to use the word humiliation because, they're trying to build up again. But we can't let them build up because if they build up, there can't be peace in the Middle East.
I just want to flog the dead horse just a little bit more. Mar-a-Lago and the 8 out of 10. Based on what I've seen, read, and heard, it sounds like President Trump held the line, so to speak, on key points, saying Hamas has to disarm and Hamas has to relinquish power. And the friction, if there is any, I would expect is in when Israel agrees to move on to phase 2 of the Trump plan. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, I believe, is standing firm and saying we're not moving to stage 2 until the last body of a murdered Israeli, Ran Gvili, is returned.
Yep.
That's negotiable, and it also plays to Netanyahu's strengths to delay. And
it does indeed.
Also, we have to understand the parameters. Before we say we're in stage 2, what is stage 2? What are we moving towards? Who is going to participate in the ISF, the on-the-ground military oversight, peacekeeper capability with guns? How is Hamas going to be disarmed and removed from power? And who are the technocrats that are going to take their place? Keep in mind, Tony Blair had been sort of identified before or the day it was announced by Trump and others. Sir Tony Blair was the kind of top candidate. He's now removed from the running, or seems to be. He himself said, I'm not going to do it. A number of Arab states had problems with Sir Tony taking the role, and I don't see an obvious candidate. So the 8 out of 10 you're giving, I'm assuming, comes from the fact that the key points with respect to disarming Hamas and removing them from power remain. President Trump remains committed to those 2 points.
Yeah,
Then
but the progress itself, progress itself is very limited. It's a 3 or a 4 out of 10 at best.
And that's why my sense is that the Americans are pushing or trying to push Israel to move a little more, or allow even the appearance of movement towards phase 2 to begin, so that it doesn't seem to be stalled, which it is.
I didn't see that, Vivian. I was looking for American language and insinuation applying more pressure on Israel to move on. I didn't see that, and I think the main reason why it isn't there is because the Americans, when they look beyond the curtain to see what they have lined up, there isn't a lot of stuff lined up behind the curtain, so there's no need to push the Israelis, because once the Israelis say, okay, you know what, open the curtain, there isn't much there. And we spoke about no willing partners to do peacekeeping or peace enforcement, and no real understanding of who that technocratic government will be. And, that government, that is a few months in the future. First, per the agreement, per the Security Council resolution, Hamas needs to be disarmed and out of power. That isn't going to be something instant. And as long as there aren't soldiers, military, that are willing to do it, then no need to push the Israelis because it isn't happening yet.
Yeah, and the concern, of course, here that we're dancing around is that the IDF is going to have to go back in and finish the job. And that will, if it's going to come about, is likely to come about in the coming year. I would think in the coming months even. But we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's fair to assume that up until the American midterms, that'll be a very important milestone. And I think there will be pressure on the Israeli side from Israel to get things done before the midterms, knowing, based on history, not a lot more, that usually the electorate goes contrary to the president and that the second part of a presidential term is more challenging in terms of real executive power, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And I think Israel is very cognizant of that. I think the president is cognizant. Maybe he believes, and he probably knows best, that this time will be different. Maybe the Democratic Party is in such disarray and so engulfed by fringe elements that they won't be able to do the historical norm. I don't know. But bottom line is, I think that a lot, what needs to be done probably has to be done before the midterms.
And of course, the midterms this year also kind of converge with possibly Israeli elections. The Israeli election has to be held at the latest October
Yeah.
2026. That's the smart money, in my view, is on that it will be earlier because kind of weird and tricky to have an election or on or around the third anniversary of October 7th. So we'll see about that. Okay. So Gaza, basically, you give them an 8 out of 10, but the reality is nothing really seems to have changed or happened other than America reaffirming its commitment to disarm Hamas and to have them removed from power, right?
Yeah,
This is okay.
that's the
So
bottom
let's
line.
All right, now we're going to part 2 of this special extended podcast, where we focus on the recognition of Somaliland by Israel, which is, in fact, the only country in the world to recognize the breakaway from Somalia. The story has dominated the news in Israel, along with all the other regular stuff, for the last week or so. And I'm confident in saying that until then, probably 99% of Israelis, myself included, maybe more, had never heard of Somaliland. But Jonathan Conricus, I should not be surprised, turns out to be the exception, with an impressive depth of knowledge about the region, politics, culture, the whole Megillah. This is a fascinating segment. Okay, so we're going to do the region, including Iran, after. But what I want to do now is just take a bit of a breather and move to Somaliland, which you were just telling me before we started to record that you are in the midst of writing an op-ed for the Jerusalem Post about Somaliland. And for those of our listeners in North America who may not be aware of what Somaliland is and how big a story it has become in Israel, we in Israel is the first country in the world to recognize Somaliland, which is an enclave in Somalia. I didn't know that Lieutenant Colonel Conricus was an expert in the matter, and I'm thrilled that you are. Before we get into Jonathan Conricus's commentary, we're going to run this clip from Israel's Channel 11. It gives a really nice, quick overview of the issue, as well as great visuals. I expect you'll enjoy it.
השמיים מעל ההר גייסה בירת סומלילנד התמלאו הלילה בזקוקי דינור. דגל ישראל הוקרן על מבנה בעיר וברחובות חגגו המונים. אחרי יותר מ3 עשורים של המתנה, סומלילנד מקבלת את מה שחלמה עליו, הכרה רשמית ממדינה ראשונה בעולם החברה באום, מדינת ישראל.
I want you to know that I'm signing now, as we speak, Israel's official recognition of Somaliland.
בישראל רואים במהלך הזה הרבה יותר ממחווה דמוקרטית. זו דריסת רגל אסטרטגית בקרן אפריקה על פתחו של מיצר באב אל מנדב, בנקודה קריטית למלחמה מול האיום החותי והשאיפות האיראניות בים האדום.
I want to use this opportunity, sir, to invite you to an official visit to Israel. Of course, I'll communicate to President Trump your willingness and desire to join the Abraham Accords.
עבור סומלילנד, המכונה לעתים הנס של קרן אפריקה, זהו רגע של צדק מאוחר. מה שהכריזה על עצמאותה מסומליה ב-1991, היא הצליחה לשמור על דמוקרטיה יציבה, צבא מסודר ומטבע מקומי, וכל זאת ללא סיוע בינלאומי רשמי.
I'm the happiest person in the world today. I express my wholehearted appreciation to the state of Israel for its brave decision, which reflects both historical continuity and confidence in Somaliland's demonstrated commitment to peace, stability, and responsible governance.
אבל בזמן שבסומלילנד חוגגים, באזור הרוחות סוערות. מצרים, שרואה בקרן אפריקה את החצר האחורית שלה, מיהרה לגנות, יחד עם טורקיה וג'יבוטי השכנה. הלילה הצטרפו לגינויים גם ירדן, כווית, עיראק, תימן, איראן, סעודיה וקטר, שקראה לישראל להכיר בפלסטין. סומליה, שבתחומה נמצאת סומלילנד, טענה כי זוהי פגיעה בריבונות שלה.
סומלילנד לאחונסרי, waxay nagu tahay dhaawac weyn ay nagu tahay mana ogolin mana ogolaan doono Soomaaliyana dhulka iskale ma laha maxuu ahay Somaliland wax Somaliland la yiraahdana ma jiraan.
ההד הגיע גם לעזה. חמאס פרסם הודעה שבה נאמר שההכרה בעצמאות סומלילנד מהווה תקדים מסוכן. בארגון הטרור ניסו לקשור בין ההכרה לבין הדיווחים על תוכנית ישראלית ליישוב פלסטינים בסומלילנד. בירושלים הופתעו מתגובתו של הנשיא טראמפ שבחר לצנן את ההתלהבות. בשיחה עם ניו יורק פוסט הוא תהה מישהו בכלל יודע מה זה סומלילנד, והבהיר כי ארצות הברית לא מתכוונת לשנות את המדיניות שלה כרגע.
Next year in Jerusalem, we say. It's a few days from now. Thank you, sir.
Sure, I will be glad to be in Jerusalem as soon as possible.
בישראל חתמו, בסומלילנד שמחו, אבל המבחן האמיתי רק מתחיל. האם האימור הישראלי על האישות המדינית בקרן אפריקה יביא לשינוי אסטרטגי בים האדום, או שמא הוא יבודד את ישראל עוד יותר בזירה הזו?
Now, back to our Horn of Africa Somaliland expert, Jonathan Conricus. Why did Israel recognize it, and what are the implications politically and in terms of security?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I spent a few years researching and covering the Horn of Africa when I was seconded to the UN, Department of Peacekeeping Operations. I was there for 3 years, an assessment role, assessment being intel. And since I couldn't deal with the Middle East out of an obvious conflict of interest being Israeli, I chose to focus on the Horn of Africa, specifically Somalia, and studied that area quite significantly. The history, colonial, pre-colonial, and post-colonial history. And it was, I've a friend, a good friend who lives in the UK. He's a journalist and he comes from Somaliland. And he's always been a very patriotic, I actually don't know the correct word for it, but proud Somaliland origin. And he's always been favorable towards Israel, and we've always spoken about which country will be the first to recognize Somaliland, when will it happen, and why hasn't it happened so far. Now, for those, without getting too deep into the woods, Somaliland is the only part of Somalia that isn't a failed, miserable state. It is an area, northwestern Somalia, bordering Ethiopia and Eritrea, and of course the Gulf of Aden, the Pacific Ocean to the north, which is separate from Somalia, which became part of Somalia when Somalia was given independence after the Second World War from different colonial powers. And it has developed in a different trajectory than Somalia, and it's gone in a much better way. It has adopted its own currency, its own military, it governs its own territory, holds elections, fairly regular, foreseeable elections that are relatively transparent and not corrupt, definitely by African standards, very good. and where the level of violence is extremely low in comparison to the region, and where there is no or very little jihadi Islamist presence. Now, Somalia is another pet project of the international humanitarian industry. It's a country that receives tremendous international aid and where there are lots of international interests and interference and presence in Somalia. And there's been this taboo, which very much reminds me of the dogma regarding how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must end, according to the same people in that same ecosphere. It must end with a two-state solution, and it must end with full Palestinian self-determination. And with Somalia, it's been kind of different, where for many years, the area that has been supported by the world has been an example in failure, in misgovernance, in corruption, in violence, in a fertile breeding ground for jihadi extremist elements. Al-Shabaab is the local flavor, basically an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but homegrown and Somali. ISIS has a presence in northeastern Somalia, and they've spread from there. And it's really a miserable place, ranking either last or just before last in almost every human index that there is. And yet, even though Somaliland has, through hard work, diligence, and strategic leadership, paved a different path for themselves, the world kind of forces the union of the two areas to be together. That's the backdrop of it. What Israel did was, I think, to rattle a few cages. Israel rattled a Turkish cage, Israel rattled the Iranian cage, and Israel, I think, did a pretty smart, evasive or divisive maneuver in order to shake things up a little bit in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, and perhaps to send a message to the different powers, regional and global, that Israel also knows how to play offense and not only being at the receiving end and playing defense against different global and regional powers. Meaning, with this, Turkey has a lot of interest in Somalia. They've been invested there with infrastructure, with religious services, with mosques, with cultural institutes, and of course, they're looking to exploit local resources, gas, oil, but they currently are exploiting fishing and many other things. And they believe that they own that area, and that is a Turkish sphere of influence that no one else should interfere with. When Israel made this diplomatic move, that rattles the Turkish cage, and they were first and the most vehement criticizers against the Israeli recognition. Regarding Iran, it's pretty self-explanatory. It is a few hundred miles from Yemen, and having an alliance with a country that's on the other side of or close to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is of strategic importance. Intel, monitoring, perhaps as a forward operating base, even though we are not there at all. But it could implicate that Israel would have the ability to do so in the future. So with regards to the Houthis, with regards to Yemen, and implicably to Iran, it obviously is a kind of an arrow in that direction. Interesting to see is that a lot of countries and a lot of organizations, the EU, the Arab League, the Coalition of Islamic Muslim countries, and the African Union condemned the Israeli recognition, but one country was missing, and that's Ethiopia. Ethiopia is probably in on the deal here, and I think that they will be looking to establish what they need very dearly, and that is access to the sea, and that they will be part of some agreement where if Somaliland becomes a country, they will get access to the port of Berbera, and that'll be a very important strategic win for Ethiopia. Up until now, they have said absolutely nothing, that they're still studying the Israeli move. One minister kind of went off script and said that it was a bold or a very meaningful diplomatic move, and then he retracted the tweet. But other than that, Ethiopia hasn't said anything, which I translate into strong support. They just don't have the political stomach and capacity to go out and say, because they are an important part of the African Union. Now, to summarize, and what this means, one could read a lot of things into it, and one could say that this is a very bold strategic move that does this and that and destabilizes and offensive, etc. Currently, I think that we should adopt a more minimalist interpretation of what Israel did. I would look at it as a little bit more as a diversion, as a way of indicating to Turkey that we can play in the big boys game as well. I would think that Israel, in 1 week, Israel had a big photo op of joint defense deals and the sale of arms with the Cypriot and the Greek authorities. And then just a few days after, recognizing Somaliland, both from a Turkish perspective are very spiteful activities by Israel. And I think that was an important part of it. And where I am looking at in the future is Israel doesn't have a strong track record of nation building, regime changing, foreign influence, building bases, and having that kind of footprint. Historically speaking, we're too small, overburdened with so many challenges close to home. We simply don't have the time and resources to be projecting bases and forces far away because we are overwhelmed with the amount of trouble that we have along our borders. Having said that, there may be a bit of a change in Israeli thinking, and if the following thing, which I will just say in a moment, if that happens, then I think we'll see a different Israeli strategy. If Israel will do something similar, official and diplomatic with other ethnic minorities or disputed areas in the Middle East, for instance, the Kurds, then it would become a more interesting thing, or with the Druze in Syria. And I think that's what I'll be following. If this is just a one-off as a diversion and as a poke in the Turkish and Iranian eye, or whether Israel is now going to pursue a different strategy of coalition building, of reaching out, and by trying to drive diplomatic, real-world change in the area, in the Middle East, by just acknowledging reality. Somaliland, from a very basic and real perspective, they met all the criteria for independence in terms of territory, governance, military, and on top of that, language and even currency. They had all that before, so according to what qualifies as good enough for being independent, Somaliland did that. But the Druze in Syria, the Kurds in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, those are interesting prospects, and Israel can perhaps shake things up a bit if it pursues the same kind of path of thinking.
That's fascinating. I hadn't, frankly, considered that. I'm going to anoint you right now, however, in spite of your modesty, an expert on Somaliland, having spent 3 years, and given what I just listened to, I don't think that there are a lot of people out there who know quite as much about Somaliland as you seem to. So I just want to make the point, apropos your sort of wrap there, that I think is not well understood. There are 23 million Kurds. It's a lot of Kurds. And yes, they're dispersed over a large area, but it's quite concentrated as well. As you mentioned, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. But 23 million. And they're strong militarily, and they have a very strong and fierce identity and have aspirations for independence as well. So I think that's going to be interesting to watch, particularly, of course, as always, with respect to Turkey. You made the comment that at one point you said if Somaliland becomes a country. Having said that, I just have to kind of point out the irony that Israel has recognized it as a country, correct?
Yeah, Israel has done so, but I mean, the fact that Israel recognized it doesn't mean that it now is a country.
Why do you think no one else in the world has recognized Somaliland?
I think inertia, the UN-led humanitarian industry
Right.
canonized the borders of Somalia and said this is a pet project of ours and this is how it's going to be. Never mind reality on the ground. Never mind that Somalia is tremendously corrupt, mismanaged, rife with criminality, abhorrent track record of abuse, terrorism, crime, and horrible things. Like, again, the worst of the worst. They compete with places like northern Nigeria and Niger, where Boko Haram took hold, Afghanistan in the worst days during and before the war, and in Somalia. Those are their peers, so very bad. And there's this thing, and I think it is relevant to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's the trodden path, which was given a goal many decades ago, and the system in general doesn't like, or probably doesn't have the muscle or the ability to stop, evaluate, and ask itself, are we doing the right thing? And is the goal that we're pursuing, is it the right one? And what Somaliland said, we're trying to say for many years, is, why are you working against us? We're the good guys. We have a high level of women's rights and minority rights, according to cultural norms in the Horn of Africa. We have elections, democratic elections. We have governance. We have stability. We're not dependent on international aid. We do all of these
Right.
good things, and instead of supporting us for being good, for working hard and not being dependent on international aid, what you guys are doing, the international community and the UN-led industry, you're punishing us, and you continue to force feed Somalia and to marry us at the hip with a failed state. We don't want to be part of the failed state. We actually never were. We were married to it artificially at the end of colonial rule, and we don't want to be part of them, even though we share language and culture, etc. And I think it rings familiar. It rings familiar to our conflict, where there is the dogma of how our conflict must end. And the businesses, the international humanitarian organizations, the UN, and many countries are one-trick ponies, single-minded, and have a very clear and binary understanding and definition of how the conflict must end. 30, 40 years we've been trying to get it to end this way. Two-state solution, Oslo Accords, swapping land for peace, etc., recognition. It isn't working. And it wasn't working in Somalia, different story, but it isn't working here. But still, I think the international system shows how unflexible, how rigid, and how committed, in a bad sense, it is to a solution, even when it is empirically clear that, unfortunately, that solution isn't working.
Yeah, it's a bit worn and tired, the two-state in the approach. It's what we would refer to in Hebrew as Rosh Katan, I think. It's kind of very simple-minded. I would call it Rosh Katan. It's parochial, it's small-minded, and it's stuck. It's
Yeah,
a
I would
stuck.
call it. I
What
would
would you
call it
call it?
Rosh Bakir. Rosh Bakir,
Okay.
head-butting the wall, which is an Israeli
Okay.
term for being pig-headed, stubborn, and stupid.
All right, I'll go with that. I have to ask you one more thing about Somaliland. How long has Somaliland, or the people who live there, how long have they considered themselves to be independent, an independent functioning national entity?
Since 1991, 92, when the civil war started or was ignited in Somalia, that's when they declared that they want to separate from Somalia. And that's when they or before that they started, but that's when really on the ground they built the institutions and the functions to support their desire to separate from Somalia.
Fascinating. Thank you for that lesson. I learned a ton, and I know that our listeners will. But I do just want to briefly share that on Channel 12, Israeli Channel 12 last night, there was a really kind of cute piece on Somaliland and what's happened there since Israel recognized the country, or the territory, as a country. And a reporter went and he took us on his little journey. And among the fun facts is that they're just printing thousands and thousands of Israeli flags, all sizes, including poster, like billboard size. They're going up all over the country. Most people, until or before Israel recognized Somaliland, really didn't know much about it. They'd heard a bit about Gaza, but nothing other than that. And they're big fans of Israel. Now, they love Israel. People are walking around draped in the Israeli flag in Somaliland. So I thought that was kind of nice, lighter story than we usually bring you. But now
Yeah,
we're
it's
going to
nice
do...
that Israeli flags are being printed outside of Israel, and it's not in order to
Right.
burn them. That's a good development.
Quite something. And now we begin part 3 of this special podcast, which I think I'm going to just call it a regional tour de force. Jonathan Conricus takes us on a swing through the Middle East, looking ahead to what 2026 may be like. Thanks to all State of Tel Aviv and Beyond subscribers. If you would like to continue listening to this podcast, then please go to our website, stateoftelaviv.com, and subscribe. The premium content that follows is available for paying subscribers only. We appreciate your support. Thanks for being here. We love hearing from you. So please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. That's VIVIAN @stateoftelaviv.com. And if you go to our website, stateoftelaviv.com, you can find the subscribe button and take it from there. Hope that you do that. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything. Thank you, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team, and thank you, listeners, for being here. Until next time, stay safe.